This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 273 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. This one is about Broome, Western Australia. Now, please excuse my neighbours crashing and bashing. I've been trying to wait for them to finish doing their gardening work, but I cannot wait any longer. I've had a bit of a break from this podcasting bizzo and I am ready to get started. So let's go. I'm recording this podcast on Whadjuk country and want to say thank you to the Noongar people who've looked after this amazing part of the world for 70,000 odd years. And do let me pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands where all of you are listening to. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about a trip I had to Broome just a few weeks back. It was like a simple and short trip. So Broome is in the north of Western Australia, but it's a long way from Perth. This trip was mostly for work. I was running some workshops on social media for the Tourism Council, so working with tourism business owners and employees. So it was mostly a work trip, but I managed to have some spare time. And I also, as I always try to do, especially these days when I travel, I was trying to follow some of my thoughtful travel principles. So namely, being largely unplanned. Now, I should say, I don't think that everyone who travels thoughtfully has to have a largely unplanned trip, but it suits me very well, and I think it leads to some, interesting moments. So when I say unplanned, I don't mean uninformed. So I still do research and I read and I talk to people and go down interesting rabbit holes, but I don't meticulously plan every second or have a, particular, not a very concrete itinerary. This depends on the destination and the timing and lots of things, but I like to be, fairly unplanned and take it as it comes. I also think it's important to be really open-minded, ready to ask lots of questions and to have some questions ready. Sometimes that's where the research is really important before you get to a destination, thinking, what things do I want to know? What questions do I have about this place? I think it's also important to be really keen to learn about people and what life is like for the local people who live there. I find that fascinating, and I think it's an important way to be a thoughtful traveller, because if we understand what life is like for a local person there, then that can inform a lot of what we do, and it's just also really interesting. So I was using, kind of just the spare time around work to travel and to kind of enjoy this place, but I still did try and follow slow travel principles. So while I'll make the most of my time, I'm trying not to race around to see and do everything, tick things off a list. So that was the kind of the thoughtful travel principles I had in mind, and I'll let you know soon how they went. But before I dive kind of deeper into that, I have to explain that this trip was actually very momentous. It was, in fact, my first plane trip since January 2020. And when you live somewhere, as isolated as Perth, this means I've really been nowhere. So it's certainly the furthest I've been from Perth for, since that time, since pre-pandemic. It's actually quite far. It might be in the same state, but in some cases it would be like crossing a continent. I looked it up. So Perth to Broome is over 2,000 kilometres, so about 1,300 miles, which is about the same as from France to Ukraine. But of course, instead of passing over numerous countries, I was just passing over my home state of Western Australia. And it's not even end to end, it's, a fair chunk of the way, but it's certainly not end to end. So this was a very momentous trip. And of course, because travel is travel these days, I wasn't even sure it would happen. The night before I left, my son's best friend messaged him to say he just tested positive for COVID. And of course, my son had spent time with him and I was like, oh no. Anyway, long story short, thank goodness it all worked out and I got up to Broome. You may know, of course, and part of the reason for this gap in podcasting is we both did get COVID just a few days after I got home, but at least I got to Broome. It was really important to me and I'm really glad I got to do it. Actually, another quick thing from before I even left Perth, I I have a sweet story to tell you, I think, from my Uber ride to the airport. I had a lovely chatty driver named Omid, and although I have learnt not to be as impolite as to kind of bluntly ask him where he was from. I understand that sort of where are you from can be an offensive question, but somehow we started chatting about this. He was super chatty. And I'm pretty chatty, but this guy was next level. And he was telling me he had been born in Iran to Afghani parents, so they were refugees there. And for some reason, they were essentially kicked out of Iran when he was about 20. So the UN was helping them to relocate. And his mum had to speak to someone in the UN office or something, and they asked her to name 3 countries they would like to go to, when, they were resettled. And so Omid was telling me that his mum picked cold countries like Norway, because she's a strict Muslim. She was always wearing long sleeves, head covering, and so cold country is better, she decided. And of course, then they got sent to Australia, Western Australia, which is definitely not a cold country. So we had a good laugh about that. But, this is the way things go, I suppose. And now I'm going to get to Broome soon, but I have to tell you one more thing, which demonstrates my lack of travel experience recently. And I know I've heard from others I was not alone in having this kind of issue. So at the airport, I completely failed the check-in test. So I checked in at home online. I think, what did I do? I can't even quite remember. I think I did manage to. No, I didn't need to print a boarding pass. It was on my phone. That's right. So then I tried to send my baggage off, through the automated thing, but without first getting its tag printed. And so the machine sent it back and saying, I cannot read the tag. And I'm like, of course you can't. I haven't done it. So I kind of sheepishly slunk back to the row of machines where I could do this. And as I did, a very friendly airline person kind of intercepted me, and I explained. She said, "Oh yes, lots of people are doing that," so I felt better. And I wasn't the only one forgetting things. Just after we'd boarded the flight, one of the flight attendants announced that a fishing rod had been left at the cafe near the boarding gate. This is very Broome kind of thing. And a guy in the row just behind me also sheepishly claimed his fishing rod. And anyway, finally everything was sorted, and we could take off and head to Broome. Yeah, that sound effect is literally my plane, because my poor son was so frustrated that he didn't get to take a flight with me that he asked me to video the takeoff and landing and send them to him. Sorry. Hopefully he can come on a trip with me very soon. Okay, so now on to actually being in Broome and how my thoughtful travel principles held up. Spoiler alert, not too badly, I think. I'm getting better at being a thoughtful traveller. I guess I've had increasing amounts of practice over the years, although, not much practice recently, for sure. So anyway, I arrived in Broome, got to the hotel, and the hotel receptionist actually told me about the shuttle bus for tourists, which I had vaguely heard of in my meanderings on the internet. I had a look and I realised it kind of really circumscribes Broome well. It stopped outside my hotel and went all the way to Cable Beach, which is, the place that everyone has heard of. So I spent my first afternoon there learning the lay of the land, shuttling around on the shuttle bus and walking on Cable Beach. Came back for a sunset drink of ginger beer at the Mangrove Hotel, which is actually also on the recommendation of the receptionist, which was the perfect spot. And, just amazing looking out over the mangroves as the light changed, as the sun got lower. And I spent a good couple of hours there just alone. I had a pizza and my ginger beer. And I think I can say I ticked the box on slow travel there, because it was... well, first of all, I just felt incredible to be somewhere finally a bit more distant from Perth, somewhere I'd never been before. And after, this several years of not being anywhere particularly new, it was absolutely fantastic. And it was warm, and that ginger beer went down. It's alcoholic ginger beer, I should confess. That's very popular up there. And I should confess it went down very, very nicely. And just the view was, I cannot tell you. Well, If you look in the show notes, I promise to share some pictures. So that was, I think I was unplanned but uninformed, and that worked out well. Now, the next day, of course, I was running my workshops, so I knew I would be meeting a ton of interesting people who work in tourism there, and I didn't plan anything for the day after that, trusting that something would arise from meeting these interesting people. And, of course, during my workshops, of course, I am, doing my best to help them improve how they promote their business through social media, but I'm also learning a lot from them. I'm learning about, how tourism works up in Broome, what's different, what's unique, and also, what it's like to be someone who works in tourism and lives up there. So it was, give and take both ways. And I think, I'm very lucky that I get to meet, that's actually part of the work, is to meet some local people and, get to, quiz them a little bit about what life is like up there. Anyway, as I had hoped, I ended up being able to arrange a tour the next day, a walking tour exploring the street art and public art of Broome with Chris and Robin of Salty Plum Social. So I'll leave a link to their website in the show notes because it was such a fabulous outing. And I know they also run a bar tour, but I already had a plan for the evening. So we went on the public art walking tour. Just a few of us, and it was fabulously interesting. And of course, I learnt a lot about Broome's really diverse history. So it has immigrants from the pearling industry. So there's a big Japanese presence there, and particularly in its history, as well as the local Indigenous people. And it's just a really interesting mix, quite a unique town. And nothing really quite like it elsewhere. So it was just fascinating, and they have managed to invest, a reasonable amount in public art and street art. So to the point where this tour really just, kind of scratched the surface, even though we saw so much. So I really love that, and that was one of those, unplanned, fortuitous things that sounded really interesting to me, and off we went. I did have an afternoon free then. It was kind of my last chunk of free time in Broome, and I spent most of it wandering and walking because I do love to have a good walk. It was pretty warm, but I just took it slow and had lots of water. I did also end up having a drink and a meal at Matzo's Ginger Beer Brewery, which is really iconic. Everyone knows about Matzo's. Certainly everyone in Western Australia knows about Matzo's. And it was great to actually be there. Now, I did also know before I got there that most of the other kinds of tours and other outings available or wouldn't be available. They wouldn't be running yet. It was off-peak. And that's the reason that I was asked to run the training at that time because it was just before the tourism season really started. So a lot of people who don't spend all year in Broome would have come back, but they wouldn't yet be busy with their tours. And so that's, I knew that this would be the case. So I actually I had hoped to get on, there's a few really great Indigenous-led tours out of Broome. And I did do a bit of a ring around to see if anyone was already offering tours. And there was a couple, but they're all at the wrong time. And a lot of them either weren't working yet or were not working because actually at that kind of very week, COVID had just struck Broome for the first time. There was an increasing number of cases where there had, I think, been nearly none for the entire pandemic. So that's fine, and it gives me something to go back for. And also knowing that I couldn't do much else, that these things that I, otherwise would really want to do were unavailable, kind of helps me slow down because otherwise, I don't always abide properly by my principles, and I would have been tempted, I think, to overbook myself. So yeah, that was what it was. Now, I did want to kind of reiterate a little bit about how talking to people is such a fabulous part of being a thoughtful traveller. So it started right on my arrival in Broome with my taxi driver. He was a British guy. He'd only moved up to Broome from Perth a couple of years earlier, I think, kind of for semi-retirement. Now he drives taxis a few hours most days, and he was telling me all about how the tourism peak season has gone absolutely insane since the pandemic. I think a lot of Perth people who would go, for example, to Bali or other parts of Southeast Asia were going to Broome instead, which I can understand. He said 60,000 tourists for a town of 16,000, so quadruple the number, basically. That's like a massive influx. I cannot imagine. So then, of course, I also got to chat with all my workshop participants. So there were tour operators, accommodation owners, pilots, all kinds of people. We learnt so much from Broome about Broome from them. And we also had a networking event with even more of those, so that was great. And then one of my favourite parts was I have a high school friend who works up there in the justice system, and I knew she would have some fascinating stories. I asked her to show me around the real Broome, and she really did. She's lived up there for quite a few years now, and she could show me, like all sides. So the sides that tourists don't normally see, the old prison, it's 100 years old or so, housing probably double the intended occupants at the moment and not in great conditions. And there's a lot of discussion about building the new one, but no one can decide where it will go. She showed me where sometimes there's violence that can flare up and plunge the whole town into alcohol restrictions to kind of quell that violence. She also mentioned how there's a massive shortage of accommodation at the moment from Perth people buying up holiday houses during the pandemic. She said local businesses just can't get staff to come up because there's nowhere for them to work, which is a massive problem. And, even people who've been renting and then kicked out and got nowhere to go, families who've just essentially homeless, they're sleeping in other people's living rooms. So that's really hard. She also explained to me about the local Indigenous traditional landowners in the region, that there's actually several groups, but one particular group seems to get most of the funding, and that can be a bit problematic. So all of this kind of stuff, you don't normally hear about, or you don't know to ask about, but because I had a friend, she knew the kind of stuff I'd like to know. And in the evening, she took me to the famous outdoor cinema in Broome, the Sun Picture Gardens. Apparently they're the world's oldest operating picture gardens. And what I loved especially was that on that night, I think it was like practically only that night, they played this documentary, which was about giving birth on country, Indigenous midwifery and stuff. It's called Jackamere. I'll link to it in the show notes too, because it was really, really cool. So, I know you can't always have an inside contact in a place you visit who'll, show you exactly what you want to see, but you never know, and there's often ways to try and get in touch with some local people before you travel. So I think it's always worth thinking about. And finally, on my last morning there, I was sitting near the jetty, and I rang my dad, who had last visited Broome I can't remember now, but some decades earlier when he was working with the bank. And so he had some, good memories of it, and we compared notes about what's changed. And so that was another, great way to kind of dip back into history as well. So I'm super lucky. I'm not just lucky, I tried hard, but to gather all these different viewpoints. And having all of this different input means I have a much broader overview of what Broome is all about. And of course, I was just there a few days. I've only scratched the surface, but it, gave me lots of ideas for what I would do when I hopefully return someday. And I do feel that I have, some understanding of what life is like up there. It's a really, really different place to Perth, and I have started to understand a little bit about it. And I think that's, as a thoughtful traveller, I think if you can start to understand a place the way you would understand it if you lived there, I think that really goes a long way towards being interesting and useful for you and for the local people. I think that's something that I, have always strived for since I lived and worked abroad, because that's what I loved about, having those really extended, 1 to 2 or 3 years in another country. And, it's not the same when you travel for a short trip, but if you implement some of these kind of principles and ideas that I've been raving on about, then hopefully you can come away with, a lot of things to think about and a lot of things to share. So, yep, back in the plane, sadly. I wished I could have stayed for, I don't know how long, weeks. I'm always happiest when I'm away and travelling somewhere. But it was time to get home and, in fact, time to get home and get COVID apparently. But anyway, that's all in the past, and that trip to Broome will always be very special to me as my first not quite proper trip, because it was a work trip, but it did feel like a proper trip and somewhere new and different, and gave me that revitalized, refreshed kind of brain spinning, whirring with creative ideas kind of feeling that travel normally gives me. So thank you, Broome. Thank you to the Yaru people who are now mentioned on the departure sign at the Perth airport. I hadn't, because it's been so long since I've flown anywhere from Perth airport. It was great to see that the departure signs now include the Indigenous country names as well. So that's it for episode 273 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I hope you've enjoyed my ponderings on being a thoughtful traveller, and especially my excitement to finally get away somewhere a bit different and new. There'll be a couple of links in the show notes that you might like to check out. First of all, to Salty Plum Social, where through which I did the awesome public art and street art tour. They're at saltyplumsocial.com.au, and as promised, I'll also leave a link to that documentary I saw called Jacamere, birthingoncountry.com/Jacamere. Don't forget to come and chat with us in our groups. The Facebook group is just search for Thoughtful Travellers on Facebook and you'll find us there. If you prefer LinkedIn, come to notaballerina.com/LinkedIn and that will redirect you. And as promised, also I'll put some photos from my Broome trip in the show notes, and they will be for this episode at notaballerina.com/273. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.